Do you remember a few weeks ago 5 police vehicles were involved in a bit of a pile-up on the A1 near the A69 turn-off and resulted in 7 police officers going to hospital? Well, today the driver of that BMW X5, Maziar Azabonyad, has been appearing at Newcastle Crown Court for sentencing. But before we get into the nuts and bolts and details about what happened in court, I'm just going to remind everybody in broad terms, before going into a bit more detail, exactly what happened and how we got here. At around 2:30 a.m. on the 9th of April, officers tried to stop a BMW with a defective light in Gateshead. What followed was a high-speed pursuit that ended in 5 police vehicles being wrecked, 7 injured officers requiring hospital treatment, and the A1 closed 13 hours. And at the centre of it all, a 20-year-old personal trainer who thought it was okay to make off from the police. Even after being arrested, charged, and receiving bail conditions not to drive, Azabonyad was seen driving to work like nothing had happened, refuelling his car, smiling on CCTV. That's not panic, that's arrogance. But this story isn't just about ego or a sense of entitlement. It's about the blatant disregard for UK laws. It's about behaving in a way where you think the rules just don't apply to you. It also brings into sharp focus the dangers the police face when becoming involved in pursuits and trying to stop and apprehend drivers of vehicles who are driving in dangerous ways or breaking other road traffic laws, and then fail to stop when the police officers activate their blue lights and sirens. It's an absolute miracle how nobody in that collision was either seriously injured or killed. An absolute miracle. And for those of you out there who are of a reasonable mind, you will understand why police officers don't have the authority to pursue kids, young lads, men on unlicensed scrambler bikes on our roads, because the risk of serious injury or death to the rider, to police officers and to ordinary members of the public is massive. Now, before we get into the details of what I've witnessed inside Newcastle Crown Court today, I just want to address the elephant in the video, and that's because Maziar Azabonyad is from Iran. He's 20 years old. He came across to the UK as an asylum seeker when he was 14 years old because his family were facing war and persecution. He travelled across with his uncle, who he became separated from. So as a 14-year-old lad, he arrived in the UK and he had no support mechanisms around him. He spent several years in the care system, immigration centres, until he was eventually granted refugee status. And I just put something together earlier on, and I'm just going to read a little bit because I don't want to get this to come across in the wrong way. So basically, I'm not going to be drawn into speculation or political debates about immigration in this video. What I will say is that anyone living in the UK is subject to the same laws, the same justice system, and should be held to the same standards. No exceptions and no excuses. Equally, we shouldn't use the actions of one particular individual to stereotype an entire group. That kind of thinking leads nowhere good. So if you're here to make hateful or prejudicial comments, save it. It's not welcome here. And on this channel, I deal in facts, and I'm not going to have this platform being used to spread fear or hate. Thank you. Right, let's get into the nuts and bolts of this case and what's happened in court today. Now, forgive us, it was over an hour of really detailed conversation about the circumstances. I'm trying to summarise this more or less off the top of my head, but the event, of course, happened in the early hours of the 9th of April 2025. Now, leading up to this date, Maziar had come into possession of the BMW X5 SUV, purchased it, I think, through some sort of lease scheme, despite only having a provisional licence, despite only having had 3 driving lessons. And he was out on a date with a girl, the first date, and the initial circumstances happened in Gateshead in the Swalwell and Wickham area. So it was about 1:50, I think, where the police first saw him speeding through the residential areas of Gateshead with one of his brake lights not working. The police officer then requested the vehicle to pull over, which it did, and as the police officer got out the vehicle and walked towards the BMW, Maziar decided to make off police officer went back in the vehicle but had lost sight. And it wasn't until about half an hour later that they spotted the vehicle again in the same sort of area and gated. Then again attempted to pull the vehicle over with its lights and sirens, but it made off at high speed. At this point they were joined by other officers, more experienced officers in pursuits. The tactical support then took over, and it was just before they were trying to get onto the A1 that Major was starting to lose control a little bit because of his driving and hit the offside curb, but did get onto the A1, and that's when the police decided to do what you call a TPAC procedure, a tactical pursuit and containment procedure. And just as they were getting ready to do that, as they were approaching the junction of the A69 and the A1, Mazur, in the middle of the carriageway, decided to brake aggressively, in effect, into an emergency stop, stopping in a matter of a few metres. There was a collision at that point, but unfortunately the police vehicle, which was trailing a little bit behind trying to catch up, for whatever reason that wasn't discussed in the court, ploughed into the back of the police vehicles, and of course we had the carnage that we've all seen on the telly, and the 5 vehicles were completely damaged. 7 police officers were injured. Some of them were knocked unconscious. Some of them were required to be cut out of the vehicles. And like I said, how nobody was killed is beyond me. None of them received what you describe in law as serious injury. Serious injury means technically at a GBH level, because then Mazur would have been charged with causing serious injury through dangerous driving, and that's why he was only charged with dangerous driving, but also charged with 2 fails to stop for police, driving otherwise in accordance with a licence, not having a licence, and driving without insurance. It was mentioned in court one of the officers who had the most serious of injuries. She had damage to one of her knees, but also a nerve damage to her back, not to mention whatever psychological damage may have happened as a result of that incident. And it's going to take around about 6 months before that officer is back to some sort of full physical fitness. Of course, Mazur was arrested and later charged with those various offences that I've just laid out, but to add insult to injury, and this is where it just gets absolutely bonkers, because that happened on the 9th, the early morning, the early hours of the 9th. Not to mention the catastrophic effect of having the whole of the A1 closed for 13 hours and the untold amount of inconvenience and loss of money and earnings to everybody travelling to work or to education. Just can't really be accurately calculated. But being released on bail, and one of those conditions was not to be in the front of any vehicle as either a passenger or a driver. So he knew perfectly well the seriousness of the incident he had just caused. When he was bailed with those conditions, he was then arrested on the 16th of April at a SO, I think it was an SO garage forecourt, filling up. And when he was taken back to the station and interviewed, and subsequent inquiries discovered that he'd also been driving on the 11th, the 12th, the 13th and the 15th. So when I talk about the criticisms, you know, the arrogance, the ego, the sense of entitlement, that's what I mean. It's nothing to do with the colour of his skin or where he's from, his culture or his religion. I'm criticising his behaviour because that is just astonishing, to just have that complete lack of respect and disregard for the law. It was also brought up in court that Mazur was charged with a similar offence back in September 2023 for driving otherwise in accordance with a licence and lack of insurance, and he produced an Iranian international driving licence. There were some questions as to how he come about that when he left Iran in 2014, but my understanding is for that offence he received 8 points and a fine which he later paid. To the sentencing, and the judge did explain that had this case gone to trial, the maximum imprisonment that he could receive is 2 years. Now that's 2 years for dangerous driving, bearing in mind that he wasn't charged with causing serious injury through dangerous driving, and there is no custodial sentence for driving otherwise in accordance with a licence, no insurance, or even failing to stop for police. So the maximum he could have got is 2 years for dangerous driving. The judge then outlined all the circumstances and all the aggravating factors involved in the offence, but also as well all the mitigating circumstances of who he is, his vulnerability, his background in fleeing war and persecution from Iran. But in summary, the judge has awarded Maziar Azabunyad a 14-month sentence in a Young Offenders Institute, minus 22 days he's already served with an electronic tag on his leg, and he's likely to serve 40% of whatever's left. He's also been banned, disqualified from driving for 3 years, and he's going to have a compulsory driving test before he's allowed to sit behind the steering wheel of a car in the future, plus various court costs, but they didn't go into detail.